Okay, good evening, everybody. So I must tell you that I miss our live conversations about the materials. So I feel slightly awkward talking to you in this way. So hopefully, maybe next week we could find some time slot that works for everybody that we can chat at least for a brief while on Canvas by using the recording system there to exchange our views and ideas. So I will try to summarize our reading for today for you to help you navigate through it, to flesh out some of the main ideas that are present there. Uh, as an introduction, so that's chapter 2 of Wagner and Gortny collection that deals with the public choice and constitutional economics. Uh, this chapter 2 deals with, it's titled Public Choice and Constitutional Order. And I have to begin this lecture by introducing you to the concept of constitutional economics that we mentioned very briefly at the very beginning and then never quite discussed in great detail later on. So this entire remaining third part of the course will be devoted to the problem of constitutional economics. So what is the difference between public choice, like a normal ordinary public choice theory that we've studied thus far, and constitutional economics? They are related, they are similar, but there are some differences. Public choice is an analysis of the political process and the political system. So public choice analysis studies things like the legislative dynamics, how laws are passed, analyzes the functioning of bureaucracy or interest groups, voters, and so on. It studies rent seeking, it studies the interactions between legislators and interest groups, and so on. It studies the mechanics of the political system by using the tools of microeconomic analysis and price theory. So it applies economic theory to the political system. In doing so, it takes the constitutional order, the constitutional framework within which the political process is unfolding, as a given. It doesn't problematize the constitutional order itself. And that's the difference between public choice and constitutional economics. Constitutional economics is a public choice extended to the problem of constitutional order. So using economic logic, economic arguments, economic principles of analysis to try and understand the constitutional system, different sets of rules, constitutional rules that govern political process and their consequences, to study which rules are likely to lead to which kind of political and economic outcomes in the long run, to study democracy versus liberalism, to study the problems like the relationship between individual liberty and majoritarian democracy, how to balance them in a constitutional system, how to set up division of powers between the three branches of government, and what are the economic consequences of different types of arranging internally the structure of the government. Whether a written constitution is better for the economic development than an unwritten constitution. What kind of philosophical framework is better or more conducive for a free society, and so on and so forth. So constitutional economics is connected closely to political philosophy. It tries to understand the principles of the best constitutional order by using as much as possible the tools of economic analysis to illuminate the abstract philosophical concepts with pragmatical and hard-headed, hard-nosed approaches of economic science. So, couple of important points that I decided to single out in this paper that I want to spend some time discussing with you here. So I don't want to go over the entire paper in detail and to revisit every single idea. Just a few basic major ideas that I want to say something about. The first idea is that the constitutional economics in the context of America and in other contexts has to solve the problem of the relationship and the balance between individual liberty, individual sovereignty, and majoritarian democracy. So individual liberty and majoritarian democracy, and individual liberty applied both in the area of civil liberties, political liberties, as well as economic liberties. So how majoritarian decision-making mechanisms that are set up in a modern democracy interact with individual liberty? Could they be reconciled? What is the pathway for reconciling them? Is there a conflict that maybe could not be reconciled? If so, which one of them should trump the other one and why? And how to explain the alternative consequences of different systems that emphasize democratic majoritarianism versus individual liberty. So your authors stress very strongly this motif of the problematic relationship between majoritarianism of the democratic kind and individual liberty as one of the defining problems of the American constitutional system from the very beginning. The American Constitution was written with one of the main goals in mind: to provide some level of security for individual liberty and individual sovereignty of the citizen against the claims of majoritarian democratic government. So that was understood to be the meaning of republicanism in the American constitutional tradition, providing the safeguards and checks to the majoritarian rule in order to protect individual sovereignty and individual autonomy. So the James Madison's essays in the Federalist and other writings of all of American founding fathers of all stripes, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, they agreed about this. All their differences notwithstanding, they agreed about the basic need that the Constitution should be protecting individual liberty against the claims of a majoritarian government. They disagreed about what is the best approach, what is the best constitutional setup to achieve these goals, but they didn't disagree about the necessity to protect individual liberty as an overarching or the overarching demand and value of the constitutional order. So the entire system of checks and balances erected in the American government is created with this overarching goal in mind. The second interrelated or related problem of economic theory is that constitutional order as a set of checks and balances and limitations to the government. So you have to bear in mind that constitutional order, constitutional government means limited government. As Charles McIlwain, a British theoretician, said that constitutional government means limited government. Unlimited government is not constitutional government. So constitutional economics is a discipline that tries to explain how to create, how to construct the government that is powerful enough to impose basic social order, to avoid the Hobbesian anarchy, the Hobbesian state of war of all against all, while restraining it in the same time from becoming too strong and infringing on individual liberties of the citizens themselves. And structurally, this is shown through this model of the prisoner's dilemma game. So hopefully you're familiar with that analytical tool from your philosophy courses. Just to give you a very brief overview, what is the prisoner dilemma? Prisoner dilemma belongs to the so-called game theory. Game theory is a subfield of mathematics and logic that studies human interrelationships and human decision making as dependent on the decisions of other people with whom you cooperate. So the prisoner's dilemma is a game whereby two prisoners are kept in isolation separately. They committed a crime, and then they're facing with a choice whether to snitch on the other guy or not. So they can get away with a very lighter sentence, potentially with going free. If they snitch on the other guy and the other guy cooperates, the other guy cooperates with him. The other guy doesn't snitch himself. So that's a on the one hand, if you act in an aggressive and non-cooperative fashion, you can derive a very large individual benefit for yourself while harming somebody else. But the assumption of that is that this other person on whom cooperation you depend will play nice for you. So you will defect from the implicit agreement. You will snitch that person and say, yes, we did it together, and you will get a lighter sentence or walk free yourself, while putting all the blame on this other guy who will end up in jail 5 years or 10 years and so on. So that's one possibility. The second possibility, so that's why is it called prisoner's dilemma, because you don't know what the other guy is going to do. If you have a reasonable expectation that the other guy is going to stay silent, then the dominant strategy for you, or the best possible decision that you can make, is to defect, is to snitch. However, if you don't know what is he going to do, then you can keep silent. If both of you keep silent, then you're going to end up with a relatively light sentence, but you're not going to walk free. If you don't say anything, they have enough evidence to put you in jail for a brief period of time, but that means that you're not going to go free. So you don't have this additional benefit that you will have if you snitch against the other guy and he keeps silent. But if both of you snitch the other guy, then you're going to end up in jail for a very long period of time. So now the question is what to do. What is a rational thing for a prisoner to do? And what is a rational thing for a prisoner to do is whatever maximizes his payoff or his benefit. So that could be either staying silent and receiving a relatively modest benefit in terms of a lighter prison sentence. But this benefit for yourself depends on the cooperation of the other guy. It works only if both of you keep silent. Okay, so whether you can be sure that the other guy will keep silent, that depends. Depending on different assumptions in this game theoretical model, you can or you cannot be sure about that. In the basic story, you don't know anything about what the other guy is going to do. So it's a tricky situation. It's a dilemma. Why is this game very useful for us in understanding the problem of social cooperation in general? So that's fleshed out in your article. It explains very well the social dilemma that an individual actor faces in the Hobbesian anarchy, in which the this cooperation in which both agents will profit a little bit if they cooperate. That describes a situation in which, without any government whatsoever, if we can manage somehow to refrain from violence against one another, we can do pretty well, all of us, even without any government whatsoever. If we can rely on each other to behave in a non-violent fashion, then if we can rely, in other words, on voluntary cooperation of other people in maintaining the peaceful social order, then we can derive significant benefits and significant security from social cooperation. However, if we cannot rely on the other guy, if we cannot believe the other guy, then the best way for us to maximize our individual benefit is to attack preemptively the other guy, because you don't know whether he is going to attack you. So then the only thing that you can do is to attack preemptively, to prevent him from attacking you. So you cannot avoid the conflict, you cannot avoid risk of getting killed. If that's the case, then you better start the war on your own terms as soon as possible. So then the result of this is the widespread social plunder and disorder that exists in the state without the government. So why is that bad? That's bad from an economic point of view, because the economic development depends on the stability of private property rights and contract enforcement. And that private property rights and contract enforcement critically depend on the degree of social trust and stability. And if you don't have that, if you have a kind of Hobbesian, anarchical, violent law of the jungle, you may very well end up in a situation whereby contract and private property are not respected at all, and there is only one law of the stronger. And then the prevailing mode of value creation, the prevailing mode of getting rich and acquiring material goods and services is through plunder, through violent redistribution. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that this is a suboptimal situation from a standpoint of economic welfare and economic development of a society. Then no society can survive for very long if it doesn't create the basic legal infrastructure necessary for peaceful voluntary cooperation. So you have to create this situation in which an individual assesses or estimates the benefits of this cooperative strategy of not defecting, of not snitching against the other guy, metaphorically, or what it means in this particular context, not engaging in violence and zero-sum game actions against other people, that you have to create then legal and political infrastructure for that. And insofar as that's impossible to create without the government, then the problem becomes how to create this system, how to create the government. Because notice one thing, it's bad enough if you have anarchy in which the law of the stronger prevails, so no cooperation will be created. But you can also have a situation in which you create the government, somebody who will have a monopoly of coercion to restrain the individual conflict, to ban individual conflict. You have Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany or Mao Zedong's China that are not Hobbesian anarchies by any stretch of imagination, but the level of social disorder and violence and violent redistribution of goods and services and disrespect for human dignity and individual liberty is even stronger than in the Hobbesian anarchy. So now the question of all questions becomes, going back to the main problem of constitutional government, how to create and how to maintain this constitutional government strong enough to restrain individual passions and individual violence, and to provide a degree of social stability and predictability on the one hand, but in the same time to restrain itself from becoming the chief violator of individual rights. Because this internal structure of constitutional rules that will have the highest likelihood of creating such a government. So that's one of the key tasks of constitutional economics. How to think about these rules, the most favorable rules for restraining, for creating government strong enough to perform a function of eliminating anarchy, but restrained and controlled and limited enough to restrain itself from becoming the chief violator of rights. So that's the third idea that you find in this article, that this is a very difficult equilibrium to reach. This situation, a limited government is a very, very complicated thing to create and to maintain. So you can see that the American society succeeded in creating it in the late 18th century. So that was the genius of the American founding fathers. But I will have to say that it failed to maintain it over time. That it grew in the 19th century and especially in the 20th century. So now one of the main aspects of constitutional economics is to study why governments grew, how they grew, why they grew, what causes are favorable for the government metastasizing, increasing beyond its proper scope, becoming the unlimited government in principle. So we live nowadays in essentially government which is not limited by any strict principle. State governments and especially federal governments. So that the sky is the limit. Whatever they can get away with in the eyes of public opinion, they will do it. So there are no inherent structural restraints to the government that can keep it within any given sphere. So there is this natural tendency of government to grow. And it's very difficult to maintain any fixed limits. One of the reasons for that is that legislation, so the public choice and constitutional economics, they're very skeptical. There are two important constants, two important recurring themes and points in public choice and constitutional economics. The bad guy is the legislator, almost always. The good guy is that's a part of the first point. The bad guy is the legislator and executive as well. The good guy is the courts if they dare to resist the legislator and to maintain the constitutional order. But they're not very likely to do it, so that the judiciary malfunctions, the judiciary fails to play its role as a restraining check on their legislative and executive power. That's one of the main weaknesses that the constitutional economists identify in modern governments. The structural weakness of judiciary. The judiciary simply defers too much to the legislature. So you will even find in the jurisprudence of Antonin Scalia, who is a great hero of many conservatives and people who on paper believe in limited government, but yet they don't notice that Antonin Scalia is a great champion of the what is that called, the logic of precedent. Stare decisis, logic of precedent, and deference of the courts to the legislators. It's a kind of radical democratic ideology that it is not up to the court to be harsh in saying that the Congress did something that which is against the Constitution. So he was very careful not to do it at all. State governments, that's okay, but Congress, no. So that's one of the limitations and one of the tendencies that constitutional economists and public choices are very worried about, this abrogation of the role of judiciary as a restraining factor in our constitutional system. That the courts, for the most part, are aiding and abetting this power grab by the legislators and by the executive. And they then generalize this idea by saying that this is something that is very likely to happen in all constitutional governments and one of the main problems that we have to deal with no matter what kind of system we want to devise. That's how to make sure that judiciary is not politicized and that judiciary is not cowardly and reluctant to interfere. So all of them want judiciary to be much more assertive in its interference with the legislature and the executive. The second problem is that legislators, even if the courts intervene, that the legislators have many tools at their disposal to circumvent the judicial restraints and to assert its own will. So this is the main idea, the main problem of the constitutional government is inability to restrain the legislature and executive. So now the two key, that's the fourth point now that I would like to say something about. What to do, how to restrain the government. There are two approaches and two important concepts that we have to use to achieve this. Two sets of restraints that we can prescribe and that the American Constitution prescribes when you look at it. So the first set of constraints are substantive limitations of what government can do, which means that the Constitution has limitations written down into it that says the government shall not do such and such and such. So this is called sometimes James Buchanan, one of the main theoreticians of public choice and constitutional economics. He called that the limitations of domain of what governments can do. And in the American Constitution, I can give you a few examples of these limitations of domain that are written down very precisely. Article 1, Section 8 lists all powers that the federal Congress has in the economic life. So it can levy the taxes, it can levy the tariffs, it can regulate the commerce among the several states, and few other things that you can do. So it's a limited grant of powers. It says you can do such and such and such. And then you have the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, that are essentially sets of prohibitions to the federal government what it cannot do. So remember, number 1, Amendment 1, the government shall pass no laws infringing freedom of speech, freedom of religion, assembly, and so on. Right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed, Article 2. Then Article 5, this private property, the clause that says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, and property without the due process of law and without just compensation. So this limited prohibition of simply usurping and confiscating private property rights, another limitation of domain. And then you have no cruel and unusual punishment, no quartering soldiers in private houses, no this, no that, no double jeopardy clause, and so on. There's the entire set of civil rights and economic rights and political rights that are codified in the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights is maybe the most comprehensive set of limitations of domain of what government is prohibited from doing. And then you have amendments 9 and 10 that are maybe the strongest limitations of domain. So you know domain, what I say, Amendment 9. If something is not written in these previous 8 amendments, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. If some right is not explicitly written down in the first 8 amendments, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So you cannot conclude automatically that if something that you want to regulate is not explicitly prohibited here, that you can do it. That everything that is not explicitly written down is allowed. No, that's not the correct interpretation. And Amendment 10, if something is not written down here, if the federal government was not given a certain power explicitly, and if that power is not prohibited by the Constitution explicitly to the state, is reserved to the states or to the people respectively. So that means that the federal grant of power to the federal government is very limited. The 10th Amendment is the controlling mechanism. It says, you see what this Constitution says in Article 1, Section 8, it gives power to Congress. In Article 2, it gives power to the President. Article 3 is judiciary. All that is written down here, these are the rights. If something is not written down here, you can assume that the federal government doesn't have a right to do that. So that's a very strong, so on paper, the language of the American Constitution brings about a very strong set of limitations of domain, substantive constraints. You shall not do that, you shall not do that. And eventually it says in the amendment number 10, if something is not explicitly given to you and delegated to you by this Constitution, you can assume that you cannot do it. Now, what is the problem with that? The papers do not enforce themselves, and as we've seen, the enforcement of these substantive constraints is predicated upon there being somebody to enforce them. That somebody could be judiciary, but the public choicers are very skeptical and very worried about that. So we've seen that simply legislators and executives are simply expanding the power of federal government so much beyond recognition. Actually, the original text of the Constitution is unrecognizable right now when you look at the sheer scope of what the federal government does. I mean, no person in their right mind in 1787 in the Constitutional Convention could have considered that 90% of what the federal government does now is consistent with the constitutional provisions. So that's one problem. So now what else can we do? Can we do something? Can we do anything? Can we come up with some other kinds of limitations to make these substantive constraints more likely to succeed, more likely to be applied in reality? So that's the second aspect, is the procedural constraints, procedural rules. And by procedural rules, public choice theorists primarily mean supramajorities. So that's one of the catchphrases, one of the main ideas, how to restrain the government, how to make the government limited, is not just to write down a nice constitutional phrases in the Constitution and then to hope that somebody will enforce them. You have to create the power mechanisms that will make the application of your principles more likely. And these are procedural constraints. So the American Constitution contains some of these procedural constraints. So for example, one of the procedural rules is the 3/4 and 2/3 majorities that are necessary for changing the Constitution. So that's a pretty high bar for you to change the Constitution. It's very difficult to do it. And that's done on purpose. That's done on purpose in order to make the process of changing the Constitution more difficult and requiring a stronger degree or higher degree of social consensus in order to get it done. Also, other types of supramajorities. So the constitutional economics differs from traditional constitutional jurisprudence insofar as it argues that supramajorities and requirements of unanimity, if possible, unanimity or supramajorities, qualified majorities, 2/3, 3/4, should be extended to the legislative process itself. So that's the key difference. So that the legislature should be required, especially for the purposes of increasing government spending and taxation, anything having to do with government spending, to have two-thirds or three-fourths majority requirement to make it more difficult for the government to expand. Sometimes that might be necessary, just like this emergency right now in which we live. It may be necessary for government to increase its spending levels temporarily to deal with the health emergency that we are facing right now. But then if that's really an emergency, it is likely that three-fourths will be voting for it. It's not likely. If something is a real emergency, you can count that 80% or 90% of people will vote for it. There might be one or two or three Rand Pauls or Bernie Sanderses who are going to buck the trend, but most legislators will act for it. However, for partisan political projects that do not command a majority, then you will have to face a much tougher odds of success, because there is not enough social consensus for that kind of policy. So that's a limitation of the majoritarian democracy, is one of the chief ideas of public choice in constitutional economics. And it comes in many different varieties, and it's essentially older as a philosophical idea. It's older than modern public choice, but public choice is inspired by these ideas that different people developed in the 19th century, early 20th century. One of them is mentioned in the text here. That's Knut Wicksell, a Swedish economist. It's a very good economist, very influential economist, one of the greatest economic thinkers of the 20th century. So he advocated for the unanimity principle. So he said his argument was very simple. We're going to read it next time, so I don't want to spoil your enjoyment of that very tightly argued argument. But what it says essentially, if something is a public interest, then you should require unanimity. If there is no unanimity, then you cannot say that an intervention that is proposed is going to benefit everybody. So you don't have a right to impose costs to some people in order to benefit other people, only because there is a majority for that. So we should require unanimity then. This unanimity criterion is considered by public choice as well, especially when it comes to changing the constitution, but also in the legislative context. Another thinker who influenced the public choice, so Knut Wicksell, you will see that James Buchanan, who is the main guy in this public choice constitutional economics tradition, he explicitly references Knut Wicksell as the major influence on his thinking. Another guy who's very important, whom I mentioned to you once or twice during the first part of our course, is John C. Calhoun. And I implore you to read John C. Calhoun if you can find his book. You can find it online. The book is called The Disquisition on Government. Disquisition on Government. And the book argues for the development of something called concurrent majority, concurrent democracy. Concurrent like concurrence, that you need a consensus, you need the acceptance of certain policy proposal by more than a mere majority. So numerical majority, numerical majoritarianism, 51% is not enough. And even two-thirds majority might not be enough. You need a concurrence of different social groups and strata in society in order to legitimize any policy decision that has fiscally asymmetric results. What does that mean? That means that you make a decision that taxes one group of people and redistributes money to another group of people, that you have winners and losers. So whenever you have this situation, and you will have it very often, the paramount concern is to create a mechanism in which as many as possible of social groups in a society are consulted and their views taken into account. So this includes the supermajorities, two-thirds or three-fourths, So Calhoun was writing in early 19th century in the context of the American sectional conflicts between North and South. And he was arguing that the North was economically exploiting South by exploiting its larger numbers. North was more populous, and then they were using this in Congress to enact legislation that was punishing the economic interests of the South. So this was unjust in his view. So the North was enacting, for example, protective tariffs that were protecting domestic manufacturing industry, while allowing the main produce of the South, agricultural staples, to be sold on the world market. So then the Southerners will have to buy machines and equipment that they needed either from domestic producers or from foreign producers at artificially high prices, and to sell their goods, their cotton, rice, wheat, corn, to sell on the world market at a lower free trade prices. So this system of tariffs and bounties was created in order to benefit the northern manufacturing interests who benefited from tariff protections. They can charge higher prices and they can earn more income in order to exploit and to increase the burden for southern agricultural interests. And the only reason why this could work, according to Calhoun, was that North was more populous, that they have more greater number of representatives in Congress, and numerical majority could enact this fiscally discriminatory regional policy. Fiscally discriminatory means benefiting disproportionately North and punishing the South. And he said this is not fair. In order to prevent this kind of unfairness and exploitation of individuals by the majoritarian government, we need something more than the checks and balances that we had. We need something close to unanimity or supermajority. So Calhoun also believed that these substantive restraints, limitations of domain that are written in the Constitution were not enough. That you need additional procedural guarantees, procedural limitations in order to effectuate, in order to operationalize the substantive constraints of the Constitution. Okay, so Calhoun was also influential. Calhoun is now, as you may know, is controversial because of his support for slavery. Of course, he was a Southerner in the antebellum South Carolina, and he wrote some really egregious things about slavery as a positive good, and so on. And now he's routinely bad-mouthed and dismissed as an apologist of slavery, but you have to bear in mind that John C. Calhoun was a creative genius of political philosophy and economic thinking, and he was the predecessor of modern public choice theory. And James Buchanan himself was very much influenced by John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun is maybe the most original political thinker that American tradition had ever had. A much better, much deeper political thinker than James Madison, celebrated father of the American Constitution, ever was. Okay, so these are just some of the motifs that I wanted to share with you, some of the ideas that I have that I wanted to share with you. So I would like then to elicit some comments or questions from you on Canvas. And then if we can see in the meantime if we can find enough time for all of us to have a conference call to chat about these issues, maybe to chat about your papers and to see where you are at when it comes to your papers. So then try to pencil in some conference call, if not sooner, maybe next Monday or next Tuesday, if you can make it. In the meantime, please send me your questions and comments, and I will be more than happy to answer them in another video. If you want to talk to me, also email me, and I will be available. I'm sitting and brooding in my apartment here. I don't have much else to do than to read and write, so I would be more than willing to chat with you about any of these topics whenever you want to do it. Okay, bye-bye for now, and talk to you soon.